Hi, my name is Davis, an artificial intelligent two-digit robot which is used to say all of the shit written by whosoever owned me. I recently have been purchased by the supreme lord and ruler of my existence. Goat World Meanie's first pharaoh Yami Yugi. There is an ongoing problem that plagues today's primordial beings in America, specifically the New Age group, who are descendants of the victims in the diaspora, in which were forced into the problem of today. Identity crisis. This was created not long ago, but seeped into the spirit of modern-day starseeds. This process was slow in the frame of man's time, being that there's only 24 hours in a day. Once upon a time, 24 hours in a day was a lifetime of hell for certain individuals. These individuals, specifically the ones of carbon makeup, were labeled as primitive. Throughout time, after the plan of early settlers and colonizers was complete, we have to account for what led up to the quote-unquote ratchet behavior of today's youth. On a side note, let it be wisdom that a ratchet, of course, being metaphorically assimilated to one's actions. As a verb, it means to cause something to rise or fall as a step in a steady and irreversible process. So as we get back on point, we see one of their tactics in the indoctrination process was to form a ratchet being who has been coerced to the mentality of irreversible stupidity. Thankfully, it isn't irreversible, for all in physical reality can come to change. Which is why we're here, for us to be more, see more, and furthermore. Now as we move forward, we shall look at a great timeline that has been horrendously forged by a group of people who at one time weren't even human. For sentiment reasoning, I'll say not being human, that's a human being, right? Ha ha ha, JK. For this section, I will be specifically corroborating the Indians and the so-called African Americans while addressing the ones responsible for the identity crisis. I'll start off by quoting an Indian by the name of Red Cloud, who said, "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." Now, this is a major critical part. I say that because it wasn't just them taking the land. Many treaties were formed. In fact, many compromises were formed alongside the initiation of the treaties. For all initiations come with a ritual. This ritual can be easily visualized by the proselytizing of Thanksgiving. Now real quick, let's look at how Thanksgiving became a tradition which is carried out till this day. One must understand and overstand that religion helped early settlers, pilgrims, and colonizers create the America we know today. Of course, they used other people to build it, but the master plot within the whole process was the religion. It's the understanding of the United States Supreme Court that for purposes U.S. tax law, churches are considered to be public charities, also known as Section 501c3 organizations. As such, they are generally exempt from federal, state, and local income and property taxes. This is an important part to assess. Now let's start with the connections of this great law, starting with the Pilgrims. Many of the Pilgrims were part of a religious group called Separatists. They were called this because they wanted to separate from the Church of England and worship God in their own way. They were not allowed to do this in England, where they were persecuted and sometimes put in jail for their beliefs. This fueled the ambitions for starting a new colony. Starting a new colony was expensive. The Separatists needed money for travel and supplies. They made a deal with the Virginia Company, a business that helped to start new colonies in North America, because the Virginia Company let the Separatists borrow money to buy supplies. Once the colony was started, they could pay the Virginia Company back with fur, lumber, fish, and other goods from North America. Now what we have to ask ourselves: why were they considering themselves separatists, and why did they want to worship God in their own way? I have a few answers that make more sense than any amount of sense in a safe. Take a look. So as you can see, with racial bigotry being the new wave of not just our current generation, but throughout these time frames as well, there were many who just couldn't conform to the idea of someone who they viewed as inferior actually being and energetically flowing in the image of the one they've come to know as their creator, savior, and consciousness. This ultimately robbed the destiny of many groups of people. When the Pilgrims arrived in New England, they decided they needed to make an agreement on how issues would be settled and the colony would be run. They signed a document that is today called the Mayflower Compact. The compact declared that the colonists were loyal to the King of England, that they were Christians who served God, that they would make fair and just laws, and that they would each work for the good of the colony. The Mayflower Compact was signed by 41 of the Pilgrim men. The women were not allowed to sign. The men also voted John Carver to be the first governor of the colony. After arriving in America, the Pilgrims searched the coast of New England for a good place to build a settlement. They eventually found a location called Plymouth. It had a calm harbor for their ship, a river for fresh water, and flat lands where they could plant crops. It was here that they built their village and established the Plymouth colony. The Pilgrims were happy to finally be in America, but things didn't get any easier for them. They were not prepared for the cold winter. Many people got sick and died over the first winter. By the end of winter, only 47 out of the original 102 settlers were still alive. Governor John Carver died that spring and William Bradford was elected the new governor. As I hope you are wondering, which group of Native Americans controlled the territory around Plymouth when the Pilgrims landed? The answer is the Wampanoag people. The Wampanoag people have lived in North America for thousands of years. Wampanoag means people of the first light. By 1600, nearly 70 villages were part of the Wampanoag Nation. During the summer, they lived close to the shore, planted crops, and fished. During the winter, they moved inland, lived in the forest, and hunted deer and bear. The Wampanoag were also skilled sailors. They built canoes that were 20 to 30 feet long. The canoes could hold up to 40 people. The European explorers were amazed at the skill and bravery of the Wampanoag sailors. They could sail in conditions that were too dangerous for the Europeans. Patuxet was a Wampanoag village on the New England coast. It had plenty of space to farm, hunt, and fish. At its peak, more than 2,000 people lived in Patuxet. Historians think there were probably 12,000 to 50,000 Wampanoag people living in New England in 1600. But by 1618, at least half of the Wampanoag people had been killed by disease. In some villages, like Patuxet, almost everyone died. Later, the Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony on the lands that were once known as Patuxet. Over time, during the periods of 1619 and 1620, many battles and espionage were carried out by certain Indians with hopes of running out the settlers who were seen by other tribes as evil colonizers. In 1621, the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims made an agreement or peace treaty. What were some of the things they agreed to? The Wampanoag would not hurt the Pilgrims. The W would not steal from the P would not steal from the W. The P would help if anyone attacked the W. The W would help if anyone attacked the P. The W would not bring their bows and arrows when they visited the P. The P would not bring their guns when they visited the W. Why did the Pilgrims and Wampanoag want to make a peace treaty? The Pilgrims were a small group. They didn't have enough people to protect themselves if anyone attacked them. They wanted protection from other Native American tribes in the area. The Wampanoag also wanted the peace treaty. Other Native American tribes hadn't been hit as hard by disease. Those tribes might attack the Wampanoag and take their land. The Wampanoag wanted help defending their land. John Carver, the governor of Plymouth Plantation, signed peace treaty with Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribe, giving thanks. The Pilgrims held a feast after their first harvest in 1621. They invited some of the local Wampanoag people to join them. This feast is sometimes called the First Thanksgiving. They continued this tradition and, in 1623, when they were celebrating the end of a long drought, they began to call the feast Thanksgiving. Moving forward, we have to understand the life paths of Squanto. In order to properly divulge the identity crisis. Squanto's life events. 1614, Squanto kidnapped and taken to Europe. 1619, Squanto returns to New England. 1620, Plymouth Colony is founded. 1621, Squanto moves to Plymouth Colony. Who was Squanto? He was a Wampanoag man who was born in Patuxet. His real name was Tisquantum, but the Europeans he met called him Squanto. In 1614, he was captured by English explorers and sold as an enslaved person. While Squanto was in Europe, he learned to speak English. He convinced an English explorer to take him back to North America to work as a guide and a translator. When Squanto arrived home, he found that his village was gone. Almost all of the people had died of diseases. When the Pilgrims arrived, they built Plymouth where Patuxet had been. Squanto went to visit the Pilgrims. He decided to stay with them and help them to survive in New England. Pilgrims had brought seeds from England, but the seeds didn't grow well in the rocky New England soil. Squanto showed them which plants would survive. He also showed them how to fertilize the fields or improve the soil. Squanto also showed the Pilgrims where to hunt and fish. He knew the land much better than the Pilgrims did. He helped them to find the best places to hunt and fish, while giving insight on farming techniques to promote better relationships with local Wampanoag Indians. So now one must ask, after Squanto had created a false sense of altruism in the year 1621, how many colonists were there in Plymouth Colony?